You've read about miracles your entire life, but have you ever wondered why some people experience them while others don't? There's a pattern hidden in Scripture that connects every impossible breakthrough, from a shepherd boy defeating a giant to walls crumbling at the sound of trumpets. One chapter holds the answer, and it's not what religious tradition has taught you. This isn't about positive thinking or wishful hoping. It's about a supernatural force so real that it literally moves the hand of God. Today, we're diving deep into the most misunderstood chapter in the Bible, the one that reveals how ordinary people access extraordinary power. Two brothers walked toward God with their offerings, but their hearts carried completely different intentions. Cain brought vegetables from his garden, fruits and grains he had carefully grown and harvested. Abel led his best lamb, one he had watched grow from birth and nurtured with his own hands. Both had worked hard under the sun, but only one truly understood what God wanted from their hearts. Abel looked at his finest lamb and knew without question that this was the one God deserved. Not the sick one that might die anyway, not the smallest one he wouldn't miss, but the very best animal in his entire flock. This lamb represented everything good Abel had to offer. When we read Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4, we discover something amazing about Abel's heart. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. Abel's sacrifice wasn't just about following some religious rule or tradition that someone had taught him. His heart was completely different from his brothers. Abel saw God as holy and perfect, someone who deserved the absolute best, never leftovers or second choices. His sacrifice flowed from genuine trust and love, not from duty or obligation. While Cain's offering was rejected because his heart wasn't right, Abel's was accepted because it came from faith. This moment established something crucial that would echo through all of history, that God looks at our hearts, not just our actions. In a world that grew darker and more violent each passing day, one man chose to walk a completely different path from everyone around him. Enoch didn't just pray when trouble knocked on his door or remember God only during special religious celebrations. Every single morning when he opened his eyes, he talked with God like a friend talks with his closest companion. Every evening before sleep, they walked together through creation, sharing thoughts and dreams, discussing the day's events and tomorrow's possibilities. This wasn't religious routine or empty ritual. This was real, living relationship with the creator of the universe. While others chased after wealth, power, and pleasure, Enoch chased after God's heart. For 3 entire centuries, 300 years, Enoch lived this incredible life of daily fellowship with the Almighty. Then something happened that had never occurred before in human history and wouldn't happen again until Elijah's time centuries later. Hebrews 11:5 explains this miraculous event. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. One ordinary day, during one of their regular walks together, Enoch simply wasn't there anymore. His family searched everywhere. His friends called his name. But Enoch had vanished completely because God loved their friendship so much that he decided to take Enoch straight to heaven without experiencing death. Enoch's life proved that intimate friendship with God isn't just possible. It's what God desires most from each of us. The sun shone brightly in a clear blue sky when God spoke to Noah about something no human being had ever witnessed before. A massive flood would cover the entire earth, God warned him. Every living creature would die, except those Noah saved in a boat bigger than anything anyone had ever imagined. At this time in history, rain was just a gentle mist that watered the ground. No one had ever seen destructive storms or floods that killed people. The idea of water falling from the sky in enough quantity to cover mountains seemed absolutely ridiculous to everyone who heard Noah talk about it. But Noah believed every single word God spoke to him. Without questioning or doubting, he immediately began the massive project God had given him. For over 100 years, more than an entire lifetime, Noah hammered and shaped wood while his neighbors laughed, pointed, and made jokes about the crazy old man building a boat on dry land. Hebrews 11:7 reveals why Noah could work so faithfully for so long. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. Every day for decades, Noah worked on that enormous ark while people ridiculed him. Children probably threw stones at the strange boat. Adults certainly questioned Noah's sanity. But Noah kept working because he trusted God's word more than human opinion. When the first raindrops began falling from the sky, people probably still laughed. But as the rain continued for days, then weeks, then 40 full days and nights, the laughter turned to screaming. The water kept rising until it covered every mountain on earth. Only Noah, his family, and the animals God had instructed him to gather survived the flood that destroyed the entire world. Abraham had built exactly the kind of life that most people spend their entire existence trying to achieve. He lived comfortably in the prosperous city of Ur with enormous wealth, loyal servants who handled his daily needs, and complete security for his future. His business was successful, his reputation was solid, and his family was well respected throughout the community. Then one day, God spoke words that would change absolutely everything about Abraham's comfortable existence. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. No detailed map showing the route to take, no specific directions about which way to walk. No timeline explaining how long the journey would require, just a simple command to leave everything familiar behind and trust God for the destination. Most people would have spent months asking hundreds of practical questions. Where exactly are we going? How will we know when we arrive? What will we do for money during the journey? Who will buy our property? What if we can't find food or water along the way? But Abraham didn't ask any of these logical questions. Hebrews 11:8 reveals Abraham's incredible response. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Abraham immediately packed his entire household, his wife, his servants, his animals, his tents, everything he owned, and started walking toward a destination he couldn't see. Abraham's faith wasn't blind or foolish. It was informed trust in God's perfect character. He had learned enough about God to know that his promises were completely reliable, even when they seemed impossible to human understanding. Abraham's willingness to leave behind everything secure and familiar demonstrated that real faith requires surrendering our own comfortable plans to embrace God's perfect purposes, even when we can't see the full picture. Sarah was 90 years old when she heard God make a promise that seemed completely impossible by every rule of nature. Her body had finished the childbearing years decades earlier, and her husband Abraham was nearly 100 years old. Having a baby at their advanced age seemed absolutely ridiculous by every medical and biological law that governed human reproduction. For years, Sarah had dreamed of holding her own child, but those dreams had slowly faded as month after month passed without conception. Now, when her body was far too old to even consider such possibilities, God was promising her the very thing she had given up hoping for. But when Sarah heard God's promise about giving her a son, something powerful and supernatural happened deep in her heart. She faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could focus on her age and physical limitations, or she could focus on God's unlimited power and faithfulness. Hebrews 11:11 shows us Sarah's incredible decision. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Sarah didn't pretend she was young again or ignore the obvious facts about her physical condition. She simply chose to believe that God's promises were infinitely stronger than natural limitations. Sarah judged God faithful. She evaluated his character and concluded that he could be trusted completely, even when his promises seemed to contradict everything she could see and understand. When baby Isaac was finally born, Sarah's laughter of pure joy echoed throughout their camp, proving to everyone that absolutely nothing is too difficult for the God who keeps his word. Isaac was no longer the small child that many people picture when they hear this story. He had grown into a strong young man, old enough to carry the heavy wood up the steep mountain path, and smart enough to notice that something very important was missing from their sacrifice preparation. As they climbed Mount Moriah together, Isaac's mind began working through the situation. They had fire to light the sacrifice. They had plenty of wood to burn the offering. They had the knife Abraham would need to kill the animal. But when Isaac looked around carefully, he realized they had forgotten the most essential element, the lamb itself. When Isaac asked his father about this obvious oversight, Abraham's answer was simple but loaded with meaning. God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. As they continued walking and talking, Isaac slowly began to understand something that made his blood run cold. He was the lamb his father planned to sacrifice. When Abraham finally bound Isaac's hands and placed him on the altar they had built together, Isaac faced the most difficult test of faith any young person could imagine. He was strong enough to fight his elderly father and fast enough to run away down the mountain. But Isaac didn't resist or try to escape. Instead, he chose to trust completely, both his earthly father Abraham and his heavenly Father God. Isaac's faith was just as remarkable as Abraham's faith. Even when everything looked absolutely terrifying and wrong, he believed that God's plan was perfect and good. That incredible trust and submission saved Isaac's life when God provided the ram caught in the thorny bushes nearby. But more importantly, Isaac's willingness to surrender his very life demonstrated that genuine faith sometimes requires trusting God, even when his plans seem to lead toward death itself. Jacob had spent his entire adult life scheming, manipulating, and grabbing for things that didn't rightfully belong to him. He tricked his twin brother Esau out of his birthright by taking advantage of Esau's hunger. He deceived his nearly blind father Isaac by pretending to be Esau and stealing the blessing that belonged to his brother. He spent years working for his uncle Laban, constantly looking for ways to outsmart and outmaneuver him. Jacob's name literally meant deceiver or supplanter, someone who takes another person's place through trickery. For decades he lived up to that name perfectly, always scheming for the next advantage, always grabbing for something more. But as Jacob lay dying in Egypt many years later, something unexpectedly beautiful happened to this old master of deception. Age and experience had taught him that all his scheming and grabbing had never brought him the satisfaction he craved. Only God's grace and blessing had truly mattered. Hebrews 11:21 captures this amazing transformation. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. With his final breaths and last remaining strength, Jacob placed his weathered hands on the heads of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's two sons, and spoke God's promises over their future. The man who had spent his life stealing blessings from others was now giving blessings freely to the next generation. As he leaned heavily on his walking staff for support, that simple piece of wood became like an altar where he worshipped the God who had patiently transformed his grasping heart into a generous heart. Jacob's deathbed scene proved that God's grace can redeem even the most broken and selfish lives, turning manipulation into worship and deception into blessing. Joseph had lived in Egypt for most of his adult life, experiencing both the lowest valleys and highest peaks that any person could imagine. He had arrived as a teenage slave, been falsely accused and thrown into prison, then miraculously risen to become the second most powerful man in the most advanced nation on earth. For decades, Joseph had served as Pharaoh's right-hand man, managing the kingdom's resources, overseeing massive building projects, and helping Egypt become even more prosperous and influential. His family had moved to Egypt during the Great Famine and had grown wealthy and comfortable in their new homeland. Egypt had given Joseph and his family absolutely everything they needed: protection, prosperity, position, and peace. Most people would have considered Egypt their permanent home and forgotten about the promises God had made to their ancestors. But Joseph carried something deep in his heart that prosperity could never erase. As Joseph felt his life drawing to a close, he remembered something crucial that his great-grandfather Abraham had taught the family many years earlier. This land, no matter how comfortable and prosperous it had become, was never meant to be their final destination. God had promised Abraham a different land, and Joseph knew with absolute certainty that God always keeps his promises. Hebrews 11:22 reveals Joseph's unshakable confidence in God's faithfulness. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Joseph was so completely convinced that God would someday lead his descendants out of Egypt and back to the promised land that he made his family swear a solemn oath they must promise to carry his bones with them when God finally called them to leave Egypt. Joseph didn't know when that exodus would happen. It could be next year or in centuries to come, but he knew beyond any doubt that it would happen because God had promised. Even 400 years later, when Moses finally led the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery, they carefully carried Joseph's bones with them, exactly as he had requested. Joseph's faith had reached across 4 centuries, proving that genuine trust in God's promises can outlast empires, generations, and even death itself. Amram and Jochebed lived in absolute terror under Pharaoh's ruthless decree. Every Hebrew baby boy must die immediately after birth, the king had commanded, with cold calculation. Egyptian soldiers patrolled the Hebrew neighborhoods day and night, their ears trained to catch the first cries of newborn boys. Mothers throughout Goshen wept in secret anguish, knowing their sons faced certain death the moment they drew their first breath. The Hebrew midwives had already begun their quiet rebellion, telling Pharaoh that Hebrew women were stronger than Egyptian women and gave birth before they could arrive. But Pharaoh's new decree was even more brutal. Every Hebrew boy must be thrown into the Nile River immediately upon birth. But when Jochebed gave birth to Moses, something extraordinary happened that changed the course of history. As she looked down at her tiny son, in those first precious moments, she saw something that made her heart pound with hope instead of paralyzing fear. This wasn't just another beautiful baby. This child was special, marked by God for something greater than anyone could possibly imagine. For 3 incredibly dangerous months, Amram and Jochebed hid their son from the death squads that roamed their neighborhood. Every cry, every small sound Moses made could bring Egyptian soldiers crashing through their door. Suspicious neighbors might betray them to the authorities for a handful of silver. Discovery meant immediate death, not just for the baby, but for the entire family who had dared to defy Pharaoh's direct command. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 reveals their incredible courage in the face of overwhelming danger. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Amram and Jochebed made the conscious choice to trust God's protection rather than obey Pharaoh's evil command. They understood instinctively that protecting innocent life mattered infinitely, more than following wicked laws, no matter who issued them. Their faith gave them supernatural courage to risk absolutely everything: their own safety, their other children's lives, even their own lives, to save Moses from Pharaoh's murderous decree. When hiding Moses became impossible because he was growing too big and too loud to conceal, they crafted a waterproof basket and placed him on the Nile River, trusting God completely to protect their special son. Their desperate act of defiance saved not only Moses' life, but the entire Hebrew nation's future. Moses grew up surrounded by every luxury and privilege that the ancient world could offer. As the adopted grandson of the most powerful ruler on earth, he wore the finest Egyptian clothes, ate delicious food prepared by royal chefs, received the most advanced education available anywhere, and commanded immediate respect from everyone who met him. Egypt's unlimited wealth and power lay at his fingertips. The royal palace was his home, with its magnificent pillars, beautiful gardens, and servants who attended to his every need. Egyptian nobles treated him as one of their own. He had access to the kingdom's vast libraries, military training, and political connections that could have taken him to the very pinnacle of worldly success. But Moses carried a heavy secret burden deep in his heart that no amount of Egyptian luxury could ease. He knew the truth about his real identity. He wasn't actually Egyptian royalty. He was Hebrew, one of the despised slave people that his adoptive grandfather systematically oppressed with increasing cruelty. Every single day, Moses watched Hebrew slaves suffer under Egyptian whips while he enjoyed Egyptian privileges. He saw his own people building Pharaoh's monuments with their blood, sweat, and tears while he lived in comfortable luxury. The contradiction between his comfortable life and his people's suffering created an internal conflict that grew stronger each year. As Moses matured into manhood, he faced the most defining decision any person could imagine. He could continue living as Egyptian royalty, pretending to be someone he wasn't, enjoying temporary pleasures and worldly success while his real people suffered and died. Or he could choose his true identity as a Hebrew, even if it meant giving up absolutely everything comfortable, familiar, and secure. Hebrews 11:24-26 shows us Moses' remarkable choice that changed the trajectory of his entire life. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Because he was looking ahead to his reward, Moses deliberately and consciously walked away from the palace, choosing to suffer with slaves rather than prosper with their oppressors. He saw clearly that Egypt's treasures, no matter how impressive they appeared, would eventually fade away and disappear. But God's rewards would last throughout eternity. Moses chose his real identity over his fake identity, eternal values over temporary comforts, and God's approval over human applause. The Red Sea stretched endlessly before them, like an impossible barrier, its deep blue waters extending far beyond the horizon in both directions. Behind them, Pharaoh's elite army thundered closer and closer with 600 choice chariots, horses trained for war, and weapons specifically designed for killing efficiently. 600,000 Hebrew men, plus their wives, children, and elderly relatives, nearly 2 million people total, stood completely trapped between the certainty of drowning in the sea and the certainty of slaughter by Egypt's finest soldiers. There was no way around the water, no boats to carry them across, and no time to build any kind of bridge. The people panicked completely, screaming at Moses in terror and rage for leading them into this obvious death trap. They cried out that it would have been better to remain slaves in Egypt than to die as free people in this desolate wilderness. Their faith, which had been growing during the plagues, now crumbled under the pressure of seemingly impossible circumstances. But Moses heard God's voice, speaking clearly above their terror and confusion. Following divine instructions, he raised his staff toward the impossible sea that blocked their escape. Then something happened that had never occurred before in human history and would never be repeated again. Hebrews 11:29 describes this miraculous event. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. All through that long, terrifying night, God's powerful wind pushed the massive waters back, creating towering walls of water on both sides of a completely dry path through the sea floor. As dawn broke, Moses led the way into the sea, and the entire Hebrew nation followed him step by step across what had been the bottom of the sea just hours earlier. The walls of water stood absolutely firm and motionless, held back by God's invisible but almighty hand. Children walked safely between walls of water taller than buildings. Elderly people who could barely walk made it across without stumbling. Animals, carts, and all their possessions crossed on ground so dry that it didn't even turn to mud under millions of feet. But when Pharaoh's army tried to follow the exact same path the Hebrews had used, the towering walls of water came crashing down with thunderous force and drowned every single Egyptian soldier. Not one survived to return to Egypt with news of what had happened. The same miraculous intervention that brought salvation to the Hebrews brought complete destruction to the Egyptians. The same path led to freedom for those who had faith in God's power and death for those who trusted only in their own military might. The massive walls of Jericho had stood unconquered for centuries, never broken by any army regardless of their size, skill, or determination. These weren't ordinary defensive walls that armies had learned to overcome through siege warfare. They were architectural marvels, thick enough for entire houses to be built on top of them, tall enough to block out the morning sun, and strong enough to withstand any known weapon of war or siege engine. Every military expert throughout the ancient world would have declared conquering Jericho to be absolutely impossible using conventional warfare. The city was perfectly positioned, abundantly supplied, and protected by walls that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. But God gave Joshua a battle plan that made absolutely no sense according to human military wisdom or strategic thinking. Instead of building siege engines, constructing scaling ladders, or bringing battering rams, the Israelite army would simply march around the city once a day for 6 consecutive days. On the 7th day, they would march around 7 times, blow their trumpets loudly and shout with all their strength. For 6 days, the people of Jericho watched from their walls as this strange army walked silently around their city, carrying a golden box and making no attempt to attack. They must have laughed at what seemed like the most ridiculous military strategy anyone had ever attempted. But Joshua and the Israelites followed God's instructions exactly, even though they looked foolish to everyone watching. They had learned through their wilderness experience that God's ways often appear foolish to human understanding, but they always accomplish His perfect purposes. Hebrews 11:30 tells us what happened on that 7th day. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell, after the army had marched around them for 7 days. As the trumpets blasted their loud notes and the people shouted with unified voices, those massive walls that had never been broken simply crumbled to the ground in complete destruction. The earthquake that brought down the walls was so precise that it left standing only one small section, the section where a scarlet cord hung from a window. Inside that house lived a woman whose faith had already chosen which side she would support in this cosmic battle. Rahab was a prostitute, a Gentile, someone that religious people throughout Israel would have considered completely unworthy of God's mercy or protection. Her profession and her nationality marked her as doubly excluded from the covenant community that God was establishing. But when 2 Hebrew spies came secretly to scout out Jericho before the attack, Rahab made a choice that revealed the condition of her heart. She hid the spies from the king's soldiers who were hunting them, helped them escape safely from the city, and declared her complete faith in their God. Hebrews 11:31 shows us her remarkable reward. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. While the walls fell and the entire city burned with consuming fire, Rahab and her entire family were saved because she had hung a scarlet cord from her window and trusted completely in Israel's God. Her faith conquered the barriers that seemed to separate her from God's people, proving that divine grace reaches beyond human prejudices and social boundaries. When God first called Gideon to lead Israel against the oppressive Midianite army, 32,000 men volunteered to fight alongside him. For 7 years, the Midianites had invaded Israel every harvest season, destroying crops, stealing livestock, and reducing the Israelites to hiding in caves and mountains. But God immediately told Gideon that 32,000 soldiers were far too many for the victory he planned to give them. If Israel won this battle with a large, well-equipped army, they would naturally assume that their own military strength and superior strategy had brought them victory, instead of giving God the credit and glory he deserved. Following God's specific instructions, Gideon first announced that anyone who felt afraid or anxious about the coming battle was free to return home immediately. 22,000 men left that very day, leaving only 10,000 soldiers remaining in the camp. But God told Gideon that even 10,000 was still too many soldiers for his purposes. He instructed Gideon to take all the remaining men down to the water to drink, and to carefully observe how each man drank. Those who knelt down and put their faces directly in the water would be sent home. Only those who cupped water in their hands and lapped it like dogs while staying alert to their surroundings would be chosen for the battle. This strange test eliminated all but 300 men from Gideon's army. 300 men against an enemy force so vast that the Bible describes them as being thick as locusts, with camels that could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Any experienced military commander would have called this planned battle complete suicide rather than legitimate strategy. The mathematical odds were so overwhelming that victory seemed impossible, even if the Israelite soldiers were 10 times stronger and better equipped than their enemies. But Gideon had learned to trust God's wisdom over human military thinking. He accepted God's battle plan without argument, even though it defied every principle of warfare he had ever learned. God gave each of Gideon's 300 men the strangest weapons imaginable: a trumpet, an empty clay jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. No swords, no spears, no shields, no armor. Just noisemakers, pottery, and fire. In the middle of the night, while the vast Midianite army slept peacefully in their camp, Gideon divided his tiny force into 3 groups of 100 men each. They completely surrounded the enemy camp and waited in perfect silence for Gideon's signal. At exactly the right moment, all 300 men simultaneously blew their trumpets as loudly as possible, smashed their clay jars with tremendous noise, held up their blazing torches, and shouted, "For the Lord and for Gideon," at the top of their lungs. The sudden explosion of sound and light from all directions terrified the sleeping army so completely that they assumed they were surrounded by a massive enemy force. In the darkness and confusion, they began fighting each other frantically, unable to distinguish between friends and enemies. Hebrews 11:32 includes Gideon among those heroes who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. With just 300 men carrying unconventional weapons, Gideon defeated an army of thousands because he trusted God's unconventional wisdom over human military strategy. When God called Barak to lead Israel's army against the seemingly invincible General Sisera and his 900 iron chariots, Barak felt completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the responsibility placed on his shoulders. Iron chariots represented the ancient world's equivalent of modern tanks, nearly invincible weapons of war that could crush foot soldiers without any effort whatsoever. Sisera's reputation as a military commander was legendary throughout the region. For 20 years, he had oppressed the Israelites with his superior technology and strategic brilliance. His iron chariots had never been defeated in battle, and his army seemed absolutely unstoppable to anyone who faced them. But Barak had one crucial source of strength and confidence that gave him the courage to consider accepting this impossible mission. Deborah, the prophetess who served as Israel's judge and spiritual leader. She heard directly from God with perfect accuracy and had never been wrong about anything the Lord revealed to her through divine communication. Deborah's prophetic gift was recognized and respected throughout Israel. When she spoke God's word, it always came to pass exactly as she had declared. Her spiritual authority was unquestioned, and her connection to God's will was absolutely reliable. When Deborah told Barak that God commanded him to take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and fight against Sisera's army, Barak knew this was genuinely God's will, but he also knew his own limitations and fears. The responsibility felt too heavy for him to carry alone. Barak responded to Deborah with complete honesty about his condition. "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." Some people might have interpreted this response as weakness, cowardice, or lack of faith in God's promise of victory. But Barak actually understood something profoundly important about how faith sometimes operates in real life. Faith doesn't always mean having to be strong enough to handle every challenge independently. Sometimes faith means being humble enough to acknowledge our need for other people's spiritual strength, wisdom, and support. Deborah agreed to accompany Barak to the battle, and together they led Israel's army to complete and total victory over their seemingly invincible enemies. God caused a sudden, heavy rainstorm that turned the entire battlefield into thick, sticky mud, making Sisera's iron chariots completely useless in combat. The same advanced weapons that had seemed absolutely invincible became trapped helplessly in the muddy ground. Sisera's technological advantage was completely neutralized by God's perfect timing and supernatural intervention. Hebrews 11:32 includes, Barak among the heroes who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. His victory demonstrated conclusively that collaborative faith can overcome personal insecurity and accomplish God's purposes through teamwork rather than individual heroism. Samson had systematically wasted his incredible, God-given strength on personal revenge, selfish pleasure, and consistently foolish choices that brought destruction to himself and others. Instead of using his supernatural abilities to deliver Israel from Philistine oppression, he had pursued his own desires and ignored his sacred calling as a Nazirite. He had broken his Nazirite vow by touching dead bodies, drinking wine, and finally revealing the secret of his strength to Delilah, the woman who betrayed him to his enemies for silver. His moral failures and spiritual compromise had led him to lose everything that made him special: his strength, his hair, his eyes, and his freedom. For months after his capture, Samson ground grain like a beast of burden, while Philistine guards mocked and tormented the man who had once terrorized their army single-handedly. They had successfully captured Israel's strongest warrior and reduced him to nothing more than entertainment for their pagan celebrations. The Philistines regularly brought Samson out to perform tricks and stunts for their amusement, laughing at how completely they had humiliated the man who had killed 1,000 of their soldiers with a donkey's jawbone. They felt completely safe from him now that he was blind, bald, and bound with bronze chains. But during those long, dark months in prison, something gradually changed in Samson's heart and spirit. The pride, selfishness, and rebellion that had controlled his entire life slowly gave way to genuine repentance and renewed faith in the God he had abandoned. As Samson's hair slowly grew back, so did his connection with the Lord who had originally chosen him for greatness. The physical symbol of his consecration was returning, but more importantly, his spiritual relationship with God was being restored through suffering and humility. On the day of the great festival, celebrating their god Dagon's supposed victory over Israel's god, the Philistines brought Samson out to perform before thousands of their most important leaders gathered in their largest temple. They wanted to publicly display their triumph over Israel's champion. as they laughed, celebrated, and made speeches about their superiority. Samson quietly asked the young servant, who guided him, to position him between the two massive central pillars that supported the entire weight of the building's roof and upper floors. Then Samson prayed his final prayer with genuine faith and submission to God's will. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Hebrews 11:32 includes Samson among those heroes who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. With his final act of faith and sacrifice, Samson placed his hands against those central pillars and pushed with every ounce of strength that God gave him. The entire massive temple collapsed instantly, killing Samson along with more Philistine leaders and nobles than he had defeated during his entire previous lifetime. His death accomplished more strategic damage to Israel's enemies than all his previous victories combined. Jephthah had every human reason to despise his own people and refuse to help them in their time of desperate need. Born to a prostitute in a society that valued family honor above almost everything else, he was rejected and humiliated by his legitimate half-brothers, who drove him away from his father's house and inheritance when he came of age. Forced to become an outlaw and exile, Jephthah gathered around himself a band of desperate men who survived by raiding, fighting, and living on the margins of civilized society. He developed into a skilled military leader through necessity, learning, tactics and strategy through constant warfare and survival. But when the Ammonites threatened Israel with complete destruction and military conquest, the same elders who had once rejected and expelled Jephthah came to him begging desperately for his help. They had exhausted all other options and needed his proven military skills and fighting experience to save their nation from annihilation. Jephthah could easily have refused their request and allowed them to face destruction alone as payment for their previous mistreatment of him. He had no obligation to risk his life for people who had shown him nothing but cruelty and rejection throughout his entire life. Instead, Jephthah chose to fight for the people who had wronged him, putting the welfare of his nation above his personal grievances and justified anger. Before leading Israel's army into battle, he made a solemn vow to God that revealed both his faith and his tragic lack of wisdom. Jephthah promised that if the Lord gave him victory over the Ammonites, he would sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever came out of his house first to greet him when he returned home victorious. This vow demonstrated his genuine faith in God's power, but also his incomplete understanding of what God truly desired from his people. God granted Jephthah complete and total victory over the Ammonite forces, delivering Israel from their oppression and securing the nation's freedom and survival. But when Jephthah returned home as a conquering hero, his own beloved daughter ran out joyfully to meet him, dancing with tambourines and celebrating his magnificent success. Jephthah was absolutely devastated when he realized what his vow would cost him, but he refused to break his word to God despite the terrible personal price. His daughter, showing remarkable courage and faith of her own, accepted her fate with dignity and asked only for 2 months to mourn her virginity with her friends before fulfilling her father's promise. Hebrews 11:32 includes Jephthah among those heroes who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. His tragic story demonstrates that faith doesn't guarantee perfect wisdom in our decisions or protect us from making costly mistakes, but God can still use even our flawed commitments and imperfect understanding to accomplish his purposes for his people. David was just a young shepherd boy tending his father's sheep in the hills around Bethlehem when the prophet Samuel arrived to anoint him as Israel's future king. But his long journey from the quiet pastures to the royal throne would be marked by incredible victories and devastating failures that tested his faith to its very core. Years later, as king, David committed terrible sins that brought shame upon himself and disaster upon his family. He saw Bathsheba bathing and desired her, even though she was married to Uriah, one of his most loyal soldiers. When she became pregnant from their adultery, David tried desperately to cover up his sin by calling Uriah home from battle, hoping he would sleep with his wife and think the child was his own. When that plan failed, because Uriah was too honorable to enjoy comfort while his fellow soldiers suffered in war, David made an even more wicked choice. He sent Uriah back to the front lines with sealed orders for the commander to place him where. The fighting was fiercest and then withdraw, ensuring Uriah's death. David had become both an adulterer and a murderer. The consequences were devastating. His son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. His son Absalom murdered Amnon in revenge, then later led a rebellion against David himself, forcing him to flee Jerusalem as a broken old man. Violence and betrayal plagued David's family for years because of his sins. Yet despite all these terrible moral failures, God still called David a man after his own heart. This wasn't because David was perfect or sinless. It was entirely because of how he responded when confronted with his failures. When the prophet Nathan came to him with a parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb, David was furious at the injustice until Nathan pointed at him and declared, "You are the man." David didn't make excuses, shift blame to others, or try to justify his actions. Instead, he immediately fell on his face before God in genuine brokenness and cried out the desperate words we find in Psalm 51:10. "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." David's Psalms reveal a man who wrestled honestly with doubt, anger, despair, and confusion, while never completely abandoning his trust in God's character and promises. Samuel was just a small boy, sleeping on a mat in the temple of the Lord at Shiloh, when God first called his name in the deep darkness of night. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying near the ark of God when he heard a voice calling him clearly and distinctly. Thinking it was Eli, the old priest, who needed something, Samuel immediately got up and ran to where Eli was sleeping. "Here I am. You called me," he said respectfully. But Eli told him he hadn't called and sent him back to bed. This happened 3 times before Eli finally realized what was happening. The Lord himself was speaking directly to the young boy. Eli instructed Samuel that if the voice called again, he should respond by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." When God called the 4th time, Samuel gave this response, and God began to speak to him about something that would be very difficult for a young boy to hear and even harder to repeat. God told Samuel that he was about to judge Eli's entire family because Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were corrupt priests who treated the offerings with contempt, slept with women who served at the temple entrance, and brought shame upon the house of God. Even though Eli knew about their wickedness, he had failed to restrain them or remove them from their positions. This was an incredibly difficult message for Samuel to deliver. Eli had raised him like a son, cared for him, and taught him about serving God. But when morning came and Eli asked Samuel to tell him everything God had said, Samuel faithfully reported every word, even though it must have broken his heart to bring such devastating news to the man who had been like a father to him. As we read in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 19, "The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground." But from that first night forward, Samuel established a pattern that would define his entire ministry. He faithfully delivered every single message God gave him, regardless of how difficult, uncomfortable, or unwelcome those messages might be to the people who heard them. After Samuel's death, God continued to send prophets to Israel and Judah, but the nations grew increasingly rebellious with each passing generation. These courageous men faced incredible persecution, rejection, and often violent death for faithfully proclaiming God's word to people who didn't want to hear it. Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and saw God send fire from heaven, but then had to flee for his life when Queen Jezebel threatened to kill him within 24 hours. He ran into the wilderness, sat under a tree, and begged God to let him die, because he felt like he was the only faithful person left in the entire nation. Jeremiah, known as the Weeping Prophet, spent decades warning Judah about the coming Babylonian invasion. For his faithfulness to God's message, he was beaten by priests, put in stocks, thrown into a muddy cistern where he sank into the mire, and constantly threatened with death. The people accused him of being a traitor because his prophecies seemed to support their enemies. Isaiah served during the reigns of multiple kings and saw visions of God's glory that left him overwhelmed by his own sinfulness. According to ancient tradition, he was eventually executed by being sawn in half with a wooden saw during the reign of the wicked King Manasseh, dying one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. Many other prophets faced imprisonment, beatings, exile, and violent deaths for refusing to compromise God's message or tell people what they wanted to hear instead of what God had actually said. They could have easily chosen to stay quiet and live comfortable, safe lives, but they understood that their calling was more important than their personal comfort or safety. Hebrews chapter 11 verses 32 to 34 celebrates their incredible courage and faithfulness, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword. Throughout history, some faithful believers have faced torture so severe and prolonged that death would have seemed like blessed relief compared to their ongoing agony. Their persecutors were often sophisticated in their cruelty, offering simple and obvious ways for these believers to escape their suffering. All they had to do was speak a few words of denial, bow down to an idol for a few seconds, or participate in some small ritual that would satisfy their tormentors and prove they had abandoned their faith. The path to freedom was deliberately made simple and accessible, requiring only a moment of compromise. But these remarkable believers made a choice that their persecutors could never understand. They refused every offer of deliverance, every opportunity to escape, every chance to end their pain, because they were looking ahead to something infinitely more valuable than temporary physical relief. Hebrews 11:35 tells us about their incredible decision. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an eternal resurrection. These believers endured unimaginable physical pain and psychological torment because they believed with absolute certainty that a better resurrection awaited them in eternity. They deliberately chose eternal rewards over present comfort, spiritual treasures over physical relief, and heavenly glory over earthly escape. They understood that temporary suffering, no matter how intense or prolonged, was absolutely nothing compared to the eternal joy and glory that waited them in God's presence. Others, throughout history, faced even more brutal and violent deaths specifically because they refused to deny their faith in God. Some were stoned to death like Stephen, who actually prayed for his killers and asked God to forgive them, even as the heavy rocks crushed his bones and ended his life in agony. Others were executed by being sawn in half with crude tools, a deliberately slow and torturous method designed to maximize their suffering and create terror in other believers who might be watching. Many were killed by the sword in public executions specifically designed to intimidate other faithful people and discourage them from maintaining their beliefs. Hebrews 11:37 describes their terrible fate with stark honesty. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword, They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. These extreme forms of suffering and death demonstrate clearly that faith doesn't promise an easy life, material prosperity, or protection from physical pain and persecution. What faith does promise is supernatural strength to endure absolutely anything for the sake of truth and righteousness. These martyrs could have easily saved their physical lives by simply speaking words of denial or participating in pagan rituals. But they deliberately chose to die, rather than compromise their faith in any way. Their deaths became incredibly powerful testimonies that actually inspired countless other believers to remain faithful. Despite facing similar persecution, their persecutors thought they were defeating and destroying faith by making the cost so horrifically high. But they actually proved that genuine faith is stronger than death itself. Many faithful people throughout history lost absolutely everything they owned and held dear because they refused to abandon their beliefs or compromise their commitment to God. They were systematically driven from their homes, their businesses and property were confiscated or destroyed, and their families were often scattered to prevent them from supporting and encouraging each other. Some were forced to live in caves and wilderness areas like wild animals, wearing rough animal skins because they had no access to proper clothing or shelter. These believers wandered constantly from place to place, never able to establish permanent homes because no community would accept them or allow them to settle peacefully within their borders. They lived with constant hunger, exposure to harsh weather, and the ongoing threat of violence from those who actively hunted them down like criminals. Yet they absolutely refused to compromise their faith, even when doing so would have immediately restored them to comfortable homes, steady incomes, and full acceptance within their communities. Hebrews 11:38 says something absolutely remarkable about these suffering saints that reveals God's true perspective on their situation. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. While the world saw them as worthless outcasts and dangerous troublemakers, God saw their sacrificial living as precious, valuable, and worthy of the highest honor and respect. None of these incredible heroes of faith received the complete fulfillment of everything God had promised them during their earthly lifetimes. Abraham died long before his descendants became the great nation God had promised. Moses died within sight of the promised land, but never got to enter it. David died before the eternal kingdom was fully established. They all died still waiting patiently for the complete fulfillment of God's promises. But their patient waiting and unwavering trust in God's perfect timing was absolutely not foolish or misplaced. Hebrews 11:39-40 explains God's magnificent plan that was far greater than anything they could have imagined. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. God had something far more glorious and comprehensive in mind than what any of them could have possibly dreamed during their lifetimes. Their individual stories and personal sacrifices were actually crucial parts of a much larger, cosmic plan that would span thousands of years and ultimately include people from every nation, tribe, language, and culture on Earth. All these faithful heroes who have gone before us throughout history now form what the Bible calls a great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us as we run our own individual races of faith. They're not just ancient history, inspiring stories, or interesting examples from the past. They're actively watching and cheering us on as we face our own unique challenges, tests, and opportunities to demonstrate faith. Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 directly connects their powerful example to our present experience and daily choices. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Their incredible legacy demonstrates that our individual faith journeys a part of something much bigger and more significant than ourselves or our personal circumstances. We're not running alone through life. We're part of an ongoing relay race of faith that has been continuing for thousands of years, with each generation faithfully passing the baton to the next generation of believers. These witnesses provide concrete proof that faith actually works in every generation, every culture, every economic situation, and every possible circumstance that human beings can face. What they accomplish through faith, we can accomplish too through that same faith. Their stories aren't just meant to inspire us. They're living proof that God's power is available to anyone who chooses to trust Him completely. So there you have it, the complete picture of why Hebrews 11 is the most important chapter in the entire Bible. From Abel's first sacrifice to the cloud of witnesses cheering us on, we've seen how faith has been the connecting thread throughout all of human history. These aren't just ancient stories, they're your blueprint for supernatural living. Every impossible situation you face, every mountain that seems too big to move, every dream that feels out of reach, the heroes of Hebrews 11 have shown you the way forward. Faith is your key to unlocking God's power in your own life. But here's the thing, this message only works if it reaches the people who need to hear it. Right now, someone in your family, your workplace, or your community is facing an impossible situation and needs to discover the power of faith that we've talked about today. That's where you come in. If this video opened your eyes to something new about faith, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss when we dive deep into God's Word together. And please, don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their impossible situation is exactly where God loves to show up and work miracles. Your share could be the moment that changes someone's entire perspective on what's possible with God. So go ahead, hit that share button, and let's spread this life-changing message together. Until next time, keep believing, keep trusting, and remember, you're part of that great cloud of witnesses making history through faith.